So if we're gonna work in music, it's makes sense to ask how we imagine it. Like when you think about music, what do you think of? And for me, I hear it, right? It's like, yeah, it's sound to me. It's sometimes I imagine it as physically doing something, like drumming or playing or whatever, and those two things come first, I can lie in the dark and just sort of hear, and that's where it comes from for me. For some people, it's more visual, and old school, they'd imagine scores, and these days they'd see screens. I don't like that. That takes me out of the way I think about music, and so I strongly resist using the computer with music, right? You spend tons of time, like I don't read newspapers anymore. I, go on the computer and find out stuff. I don't really look up things in books that much anymore. I look them up on Google or whatever, So we spend tons of time like interacting with these screens, and reasonably speaking, I guess that's what music will become, is people's interactions with screens. But for me, that's another remove from how I imagine music and how I go about doing it. And so I resist that, like very strongly. Being pushed into that, it makes music into this sort of, visible, controllable object, instead of having it be this organic thing with which you participate. And my strongest objection to using the computer with music is, say when you're mixing, you've already played it all and recorded it all and done all that. If you're with a computer, you can do one thing at a time. It's very linear. You'll get this, say it's a bass track, and you'll EQ it and compress it and pan it, and you have to do all those things with that one, and maybe there's fancy ones that do better than this, but, not for people like me. With a mixing board, you can EQ this one and then EQ that one and then pan this one and then pan, you can even do both at once, and use your faders, and you're kind of physically involved in it. And to me, that's the way I think about music. It's something that's, you play with it in real time, right? It's kind of like you're dancing with somebody, or, like you're physically involved with this thing, and you're not analyzing it and breaking it down into constituent parts and linearly defining those parts. Maybe some people have sex that way, but I sure never have. It's like a set of responses and actions that go with them, right? And so I sort of fear that this is kind of slipping us away from what's fun about doing music and what's imaginative about doing music in a way. It's it alienates, it puts another barrier between us. And I think technology's awesome. yeah, I'm not a Luddite at all, but I just don't think that every step we take toward bringing more tech into our processes that doesn't always help as much as we think it did. Nuclear energy and power is a bit of a mistake. The internal combustion engine is proving to be like a bit of a mistake. Like they're efficient or something like that, and efficiency is good, but but there's also consequences from it, and the consequences aren't that good. There's a meltdown going on in Japan right now. It's, that's not a good thing. There's global warming going on right now, and that's not a good thing. And these are consequences of valuing efficiency too much. Anyhow, I think musicians have to stand up for this and, use whatever market muscle, we have to, it's not hard to make things where we physically interact, 15 years ago, they made the things that you use to record so that you would have your hands on them, and they've slowly eliminated those. A friend of mine recently was telling me about how he couldn't find a keyboard with a knob for the volume fader on it. Couldn't find one. You could type in some parameters or something, but it's forcing you to be, an office worker when you play, instead of like a hands-on person, and there's a bit of a class war thing around this that poor people, blue-collar people, interact with lots of stuff. If you're a construction worker, you have a truck full of tools, and you and piles of stuff you build stuff out of, and it's very tangible and material, as this is being taken away, like wicked old music and sound used to involve lots of stuff, it took 60 people to, with their instruments, to play a symphony. It took, the old recording studios, those are fun, looking through those, the old tube equipment they had that took up lots of room. And, there's all these patch wires everywhere, like the, old pictures of Moog synthesizers, there's just all this spaghetti of wires and all these kind of things. And that's a very tangible, hands-on, physical world. And some of us like that, right? Some of us like we like being in a world of stuff. We don't want to be isolated from that so much. So it's, what's fun about finding a patch with wires back in the day, that's an enjoyable, tactile, interactive experience with your tools. And for someone like me, there's no joy in choosing options from a menu or something like that. It's not, that isn't the same thing. I kind of chose my life as a teenager, that I wanted to work in the world of things. I didn't want to, be a lawyer or be a, business person or any of those things. I wanted to dig a hole or build a house or fix a car or whatever. You know, that's what sort of spoke to me as life, you know. And in my paranoid conspiracy theorist mode, it kind of seems like they're taking music away from us that way as well, you know, that they don't want it to be about people who do things with things. They want it to be about people who choose to allocate, you know, which is, it's a different concept of class. And there's the thing, like, you know, they're trying to replace us manual laborers with robots, you know, and so they have some really awesome robots that do things that we traditionally did, and they do them much better, to tell the truth, you know, like, you know, they're, you know, 3D printers and 3D, you know, there are mills like machines that cut electrical parts that are, you know, they're really precise, and they're fast, and it would, you know, that was really hard machine shop work once upon a time. And now if you have, you know, a couple of $100 million, you can buy a machine that just does that instead and whips them out, you know. But they're also kind of not replacing us with robots, but in a way turning us into a function of a robotic system, when what we're doing is going through menus and choosing things and allocating things and defining parameters of things instead of just getting our hands on them and making them. And to me, you know, and this is strictly about me, is that just doesn't interest me. It just doesn't appeal to me. Like, I have no kind of visceral desire to spend time doing that, you know. I think it's really fun, you know, and I do have a definite yen to, like, you know, get my hands on lots of knobs and push a lot of faders around. That's really fun. I love tuning. I like, you know, well, I even like, you know, building the instruments themselves. You know, that's all stuff that like I want to do. You know, I want to do this. Like, and I don't feel that way about running sound through programs. You know, that isn't how I imagine music in my mind. Like, you know, this might be different if I had been born like in the 1980s or whatever, you know, is that the way I might have gotten into music would have been kind of through that, you know, through this manipulation of materials that you don't touch. I'm sure for a lot of people coming up like in the age before recording was that they fantasized in scores, you know. Yeah, my dad had just piles of scores all over the place. He loved just sitting there, you know, he could hear it all in his head, you know, and he'd look at scores, and I think that's what people did who came up that way. Owing to an accident of birth, I came up when recording became something anybody could have. You know, I think I was like, probably 10 when I got some little junky reel-to-reel, you know, and I could just make sound directly and, you know, just like that, you know. You know, so I'm not like, really trying to express an opinion about this as much as I'm trying to like point out how we think about it and how the ways that we are permitted, economically and by available technology, it's impossible to get something that does what I want to do right now. I mean, maybe it's possible if I had $100,000 or something. There's probably something that, that does that. But what's odd to me is that that's something that existed 10 years ago and doesn't exist anymore. It's been removed from the, you can't get something that works without a computer now. And to me that's a great disenfranchisement, of the people who work in the world of things, that limits our participation in music, like all of those of us who, feel oppressed by screens and oppressed by menus and just alienated by them. All of those of us are going to be making less music going forward because we want to put our hands on things and touch them and physically relate with them as much as possible. Same with any sort of VR kind of thing, it removes the actual interface from being sweat and dirt and, the tactile nature of it, and sets us back a level from it. And, I'm just putting my 2 cents in that I don't like that, that doesn't appeal to me. I also find that, I'm unable to spend the time on that to have, any mastery of it, I'll give up on learning some, software program. Just the first time it annoys me. It's that's my own personal failing, but I stop feeling like a musician when I begin to do that. I feel like I'm something else. I feel like I'm an accountant, Nothing wrong with being an accountant, but, some of my best friends are accountants. But they do that because that's how they like to approach something, it's, I chose my life and the things I chose to do with it because what interests me is to interact with the world of stuff, and I think it's going to diminish the participation of people like me in the world of music the more it becomes about this kind of managerial skill set and less about, actual physical skill sets. And there's a kind of sensuality to getting your hands on things, that will get lost in music, that will sort of disappear. It turns a musician, instead of someone who enjoys themselves essentially in this environment of things, it turns them into a disposer of things with the purpose of manipulating other people. And the kind of software approaches to music are very good at that. You can put something in here and put something in there and, shape your music to do what it's supposed to, and all that with and the whole kind of desideratum about it is that it's about that end product and producing that end product efficiently. And that makes perfect sense in, our capitalist society. Is, of course you would do it that way. It's way more efficient, My way of doing things makes no sense at all in that. However, my way is fun for those who want to have direct interaction and, physical interaction, and aren't thinking nearly as much about producing a product as we are about doing something that teaches us and doing something that involves us physically, so coming all the way back around is how do we imagine music? Do we imagine it as something that's purely cerebral and purely managerial, or we imagine it as something that's mostly physical and participatory? And it's not really participating when you're just managing pre-existing things all the time. That's, I understand the appeal of that to some people. Chess players must love that, yeah, you can fully understand that, but there are just some of us that don't really think that way and don't really live that way. We don't want to, put ducks in a row. We want to kind of get in the middle of some ducks, right? Anyway, I read a thing lately that was kind of interesting. That was, there's a sense of us being replaced by robots as people, and, this is a true crisis of social theory going forward, is that work is becoming a little bit obsolete, slowly through different things oh, well, we can just have an algorithm do this. We don't really need you to think about this anymore. We just can get an algorithm to do this the same way that a welding robot on a car assembly line actually does a better job than I would do if I were there working there, right? And part of the thing is we're learning to be our own robots in a way. The more we do this kind of thing, for instance, with the music thing, is we're learning to be musical robots in a way, and we're very efficient. They can't make anything that kind of thinks as quickly as we do, and there's things that we're very good at, and so why not teach us to behave as part of the software? Why not develop that aspect of our participation in it instead of just figuring out how to replace us with a machine? They just integrate us into the mechanism, and I think this is a thing like that. We're removed from the substance of what's going on, removed from physically interacting with the substance of what's going on, and then we're removed yet another level by having very little variability with the thing. This is what, we're learning to see music instead of listen to it. And if you're always looking at a screen while you're listening, yes, that will teach you how to see music really well. But it is also going to teach you to aspire towards some visual aspect of something that isn't visual at all. eventually, like, you would be able to teach a completely deaf person to make music that sounded like good end product, you know. And it's not that that hasn't happened before, you know. The glorious Ludwig van wrote the Ninth when he couldn't hear it, and that was, you know, from his tradition, was all about scores, and so they had a visual, you know, analog to what they were doing, and you know, so there's nothing really wrong with that. It's just that, yeah, I'm just disappointed that the more tactile and the more physical and the more, you know, physically evolved approach, which is the way I imagine music, is sort of getting swept away and disempowered and disenfranchised. And I would love to see a lot of musicians kind of stand up and say, hey, no, I want knobs. You know, I don't want to look at something while I'm doing this. I want to, like, listen to it, you know? And all kinds of other things will come into it that would appear visually to be wrong or whatever, you know. Stuff that doesn't fit the algorithm is often what's really interesting, right? You know, our algorithms are only as good as our ability to imagine them.